very significantly. So I welcome all of the members and fellows of both of our scholarly societies and our councils, and also members of our broader community who have joined us this afternoon. This is the first of what we envisage as a series of discussions in which we will explore views and responses in challenging times. Our focus this evening is on science and war, and you will have read the background notes in our invitation, and Professor Jansen will give you some further background on the basis for this webinar in a moment. Suffice to say then that we've planned this to be a forward-looking conversation on how we, as scholars, can make a relevant contribution to global good at this time. And just to reiterate, in our background notes, we did say history shows us that science can do great good and great harm. And our responsibility now is to seek knowledge for the good of humanity. To lead us in our discussions, we will have four eminent scholars, and I would like to welcome Professors Stella Nkomo, Nithia Chetty, Kaimanthri Moodley, and Salim Valley. I will, as they speak, very briefly just introduce them, but you have got their short biographies in the invitation. There will be time after their presentations for some discussion, and you are welcome to put questions and comments in the question and answer box. And if we can, we will also watch for your indicating hands. To close the meeting, Professor Irvi Gledhill will give some short concluding remarks. So, colleagues and friends, we speak today as scientists and scholars, and tonight we are seeking approaches to making sense in a time of disturbing conflict. I'm going to hand over to Professor Jansen now, and I suspect that he will quote from something that I was also going to note, and that is that just yesterday we saw a statement put out by the Stop the War Coalition, quoting students and teachers and staff and graduates of the oldest university in Russia, Moscow State University, who highlighted the value of education and hearing each other, listening to arguments, and being faithful to the truth. So I think that's our starting point this evening. Jonathan, over to you to make your introductory presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. It is wonderful to see so many friends online, and of course, all for the speakers whom I know in different ways, Professors Nkomo, Chetty, Moodley, and Valley. How wonderful to see all of you, and thank you for agreeing to be part of this joint effort between the Academy of Science of South Africa and the Royal Society. I thought I should just share with you a few background notes on what brought us here. On the one hand, it is obviously this partnership with the Royal Society. But secondly, in sporting terms, we have a deep bench. We have a deep bench of social scientists, engineers, biomedical people, natural science folk, on whom we can draw in times of great complexity, great difficulty, as is the case at the moment. And as Academies of Science, we have an obligation to examine the scientific impacts of such regional, national, and indeed global conflagrations, wherever they might occur. And let me talk about those impacts briefly in two ways. First of all, the negative impacts on science. Scientists die in wars, they fight in wars. Some are wounded, many flee for safety and go and work elsewhere. Think of the flight of scientists in the 1940s, in the mid-1940s, to prestigious universities around the world as they fled Europe. But in very practical ways, laboratories are abandoned, experiments are halted, vital materials are destroyed, years of painstaking research go down the drain. This is one of war's unexamined effects, its impact on scientific progress, and the difficulty of recovery of the scientific endeavor in years ahead. Unlike a physical building, you cannot simply rebuild scientific infrastructure as easily, given its many component parts that include students, equipment, materials, staff, and that elusive pursuit called scientific culture. That is the intellectual and social environments necessary to build a strong community of science, whether it's in a seminar group in the humanities or laboratory research team in the sciences. Think also at this time of the many postgraduate students whose lives have been ruined by this European war. No doubt, some will never return to complete doctoral or postdoctoral studies. Others will have their confidence shaken and might be required to make recalculations of both design and duration of studies already underway, as happened, by the way, with the pandemic. Those are the finer fractures that war meets out science and scientific work. We have not yet done those qualitative calculations of the impact of war on senior students as vital resources for scientific work now, and as the next generation of scientists who will succeed us in time. That's on the negative side. On the positive side, science is not only a victim of wars, it is a vital resource in helping us to understand wars, their origins and trajectory, and their likely ends. This is where the social sciences can and should play an outsized role in deepening our understanding of war. As social scientists, we are often slow out of the blocks in the face of major conflagrations, yielding platforms to media platforms to generals and journalists, when what is also needed is a grasp of history, politics, economics, psychology, and culture, things that aid understanding of the horrors of war and its impacts on the sciences. Here mention must be made of the exceptional work of Anne Applebaum, who was both a journalist and a historian, on Eastern Europe, and especially a groundbreaking work. If you haven't read this book, your life is incomplete. And the book's title of the book is Twilight of Democracy. So I cannot think of a more stellar panel involving Stella and Salim and Nithia and Kay to in fact help us understand what's going on, not just in this war, but in other wars before this one, currently underway, and those to come, and the responsibility of science and the scientists. With that, welcome to all of you, and I certainly look forward to hearing my four colleagues. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for those very thoughtful words. So, colleagues, we'll move on to our four presentations now, and after that, we'll take a look at the comments and questions and so on. So the first speaker is Professor Stella Nkomo, who I'm delighted to say has been a colleague of mine for a long time. She is a professor in the Department of Human Resource Management at the university. She was a former deputy dean for research and postgraduate studies. She has researched widely on diversity and difference and race and gender, and of course then is very well positioned to be making some comments this afternoon about our topic of science and war. I'm not going to say more than that, except for those of you who are academics. Professor Nkomo is an A-rated South African researcher and very well known in her professional and academic circles for her insights into diverse areas, transdisciplinary kind of approaches. So Stella, over to you. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to what you have to say. You just need to unmute, Stella.
You're still muted, Stella.
In the bottom left-hand corner, you should have a microphone.
I'm hitting unmute. Can you hear me?
There you go. We can hear you now.
Sorry about that. Let me start again. Thank you very much, Prof. Burton. Stephanie, you're right. We've known each other for a while. Thank you, Prof. Jansen, my fellow panelists, Prof. Chetty, Prof. Moody, Prof. Valley, and everyone who's made this possible. I'm really honored to be invited to share my thoughts in the time that's been allocated. In thinking about what I was going to share today, I think it's rather broad, and I thought I'd focus on my view about the responsibilities of scientists at a time like now. So what I want to briefly do is to focus on my first talk about what I see as the role of science in society. Then I'm going to move on what that might imply for our moral and ethical responsibilities in responding to wars, and understanding that within the current geopolitical context, characterized by global divisions in power based on race, ethnicity, geographical location, culture, and resources. We all know there are many views on what science is, often based on disciplinary and philosophical orientations. That's a discussion for another day. But if you will allow me broadly, when I think about science, I might simply say science structures and organizes knowledge about using evidence-based methods to offer explanations and predictions about phenomena. Science is indispensable to understanding the world, our material conditions, our physical and social environments, and ultimately our lives and social welfare. I believe strongly that its ultimate purpose is to advance the human condition by enabling a better world for all. Or, as UNESCO simply states in its mission, science is for society. Therefore, I personally believe it's important for scientists to respond to global challenges that threaten social well-being, including wars. Thus, if we accept this ideal role for science, then science and scientists must be against wars and instead support peace and reconciliation in conflict situations. Wars are antithetical to the quality of life and threaten the advancement of human condition. And that brings me to the immediate situation of the war being waged by Russia against Ukraine. In keeping with our responsibilities and the role of science in society, no doubt the war must end. I'm hoping that the negotiations today will take us towards that. It is painful for everyone to witness the horrific killings and the maimings of Ukrainians and the destruction of their country. Over 3 million people so far, particularly women and children, have been forced to leave their homes and livelihoods, not by choice, but by the violent aggression of Russia. Ukrainians are suffering on levels that no human beings should experience. And the effects of the war will be felt and are felt by all of us. The possibility of nuclear devastation has never been so immediate since the United States bombed Hiroshima. So yes, I believe scientists have a moral and ethical responsibility to speak out against what is happening in Ukraine if we are committed to advancing the human condition. My concern is that along with our responsibility, there is the question of integrity. We have to be consistent in invoking our responsibility to be anti-war. We cannot afford to be whimsical, selective, or biased in choosing when to assume our responsibility, given that we're living in a world where there continues to be too many wars causing human suffering and displacement. In a recent article published in Nature, the authors reported that just in the past 11 years, wars have killed over 100,000 people across the globe, 3/4 of whom were in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. The article also pointed out, although major wars between nations like the one we see now have decreased, the number of civil wars have doubled since the 1960s. The UN Refugee Agency estimates there are currently close to 27 million war refugees around the world, half of whom are under the age of 18. On our own continent, thousands of lives of people have been lost, and nearly 4 million people, I'm thinking of Sudan. Since 2013, nearly 4 million people from their homes in Sudan have had to flee. The war in Ethiopia has also killed many and displaced hundreds of thousands. My point is, I believe our responsibilities as scientists is to speak out against human suffering caused by wars, regardless of the location, the culture, the religion, and the race and ethnicity of those affected. As I watch what is happening today, what resonates with me is Martin Luther King's words in his 1967 speech titled Beyond Vietnam, where he called for the United States to end the war it prosecuted against Vietnam. I believe his words apply today. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Being ethical requires consistency. Our moral values and actions should not be contradictory. We have to worry deeply that speaking against some wars and not others may imply some lives and places are more valuable than others. In deciding which wars to be against and which ones to remain silent about, we run the risk of endorsing the patterns of the discredited colonial order, which has left a legacy of dangerous inequalities based on race and geography, as well as power. These inequalities position the West as dominant, always right, despite evidence to the contrary. This geopolitical reality shrouds the world, too often influencing which wars deserve our attention and consequently, which nations and people merit empathy and support. There is some evidence of this reality rearing its presence in the war between Russia and Ukraine. A recent article in The Conversation described the racist logic of the treatment of refugees from Ukraine, where Black, Middle Eastern, and Indian people were less welcomed in some countries. Other examples include the exceptional reception of Ukrainians. Of course, they should be well received in many countries in Europe and also the United States. But unfortunately, refugees from Latin America, Africa, and Middle East, and most recently Afghanistan, linger in camps or experience harsh treatment by border officials. Wars impede progress towards enabling a better world for all and addressing the stubborn challenges that face the world. Poverty, competition for scarce resources, pandemics, climate change, and inequalities based on race, ethnicity, gender, class, religion, and nationality. Hopefully, Sometimes an unexpected, disruptive event can jar us into different ways of seeing and being. My hope is for a reflexive discussion today that allows us to think deeply about what is at stake for all of humanity and what we can contribute to ending conflicts and supporting humanitarian interventions, not only in Ukraine, but other parts of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella, for a very insightful and philosophical view. And I think what you've said is a very good way to start to think about all of this. We'll move on now to Professor Nithia Chetty, who is at the moment the Dean of the Faculty of Science at the University of the Witwatersrand, but I claim him also as my long-standing colleague. Professor Chetty is a physicist, and he is also very active in RF circles as the CEO has been a CEO for astronomy, and he is at the moment the Vice President of the International Union for Pure and Applied Physics. So he has, I think, come from a different background from Stella, and I'm sure we will hear some different views, but I'm sure some common ground. Thank you, Nithia. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephanie. Thank you, Jonathan, as well. I appreciate the invitation. I just have 10 minutes, so let me get on with it. Colleagues, as long as there are wars, there will always be a need for weapons. And it is true that weapons are the product of science and has been since the beginning of time. With weapons development, basic science would have played a role at the outset. For example, the fission of uranium atoms was discovered curiously, as it turns out, during Christmas vacation in 1938 by 2 German scientists. But it didn't take long for individuals to see the potential for creating nuclear weapons of mass destruction barely 7 years later. That would be true for chemical weapons, biological weapons, and all sorts of technically advanced delivery systems today. These weapons are based on the fundamentals of science. Much of weapons research is driven by the government in directed research programs around the world, or by companies with a commercial interest, but with little ethical principles or considerations of the often existential threat that this poses to humanity. But science also has an important unifying role to play in this world, and it would be remiss of us not to recognize that and make that work better, especially in this time of war. However, an environment of free academic discourse needs to be nurtured in order for this to work properly, and we need to give this more attention. This intellectually free environment is not only important for our own self-interest as academics, and I must admit that we have the habit of creating curious characters, mavericks even, in the academic setting because of this right to academic freedom. But this is essential for society too, and for democracies to work better. Democracies need independent checks and balances to function successfully, or else we will spiral into dictatorships, which can lead to discord and even to war. Expert scientists who know the potential impacts of the work need to be vigilant to nefarious applications of science and must speak out on matters of concern to society. As scientists, we must be concerned about the real danger posed by weapons and the welfare of our fellow scientists, including our students, of course. Scientists have that freedom, and I would say the responsibility to express themselves on matters of relevance to society, even if this is contrary to the views of the government. Our democracy should be robust enough to withstand criticism. And I want to say that the academic body must stand up for these freedoms the moment there's even a murmur of a threat to these freedoms. And in here, the Academy has an important role to play. Science and the principles by which we pursue science is a universal endeavor. The amazing thing is that you can travel half the way around the world, and despite our political, cultural, geographic, and linguistic differences, we still speak the same language of science. Science unites us. We should never shut down the channels for reasoned engagements across our many different divides across the world. Science builds understandings and friendships across our differences based on rational discourse, and this should not be underestimated as a driver for peace. And so, when we fail through political diplomacy to achieve peace, we must keep open the channels for scientific diplomacy. This worked well during the Cold War. For instance, we remember Andrei Sakharov, who was a Soviet nuclear physicist, dissident, Nobel laureate, and activist for disarmament, peace, and human rights. It was because there was scientific cooperation across the Iron Curtain that we were eventually able to bring down that curtain. Reason triumphed in the end. Scientific cooperation played an important part in that, and we should recognize that and applaud that. Now today, we have an unnecessary and cruel war brought about by the ambitions of a singularly focused man with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This should be seen as an onslaught against the democratic principles that we so cherish in our own country. This should be roundly condemned, together with the many other conflicts of war around the world taking place in Africa, in the Middle East, and elsewhere. However, South Africa, with 34 other countries, abstained in a non-binding vote at the United Nations a month ago to condemn Russia's belligerence. I think that this decision lacked moral courage on the part of our government. This has also created a lot of anxieties amongst our own academics and researchers concerning scientific cooperation with Russia and with Ukraine. We have well-established collaborations with both countries. Of course, we understand that government sets policy and will usually take expert academic inputs into consideration, but also other inputs that can loosely be referred to as political considerations. For example, South Africa is a member of BRICS, and many of our leaders sought refuge in Russia during our struggle years. But Brazil voted in support of the United Nations resolution, and as it turns out, Ukraine also hosted South Africans in exile during our struggle years. The question for me is whether South Africa's abstention at the United Nations is consequential for us as a nation. The most recent lukewarm proposal that South Africa presented to the United Nations late last week, which did not see the light of day, makes me wonder about our government's real intentions and what is driving this. Let's make no mistake here, Ukraine is the victim under an unwarranted attack by its powerful neighbor. Millions are being displaced, thousands have been killed, there's wanton destruction of property, universities and other educational and cultural institutions are under attack. Scientists and students, including our own African students, are fleeing. There's potential for catastrophe if nuclear facilities are hit. The proud and rich intellectual heritage of that country is being obliterated. We have the threat of nuclear war. That is not a regional problem, but a global problem, and will break the more than 70-year moratorium that we've had in place for exploding a nuclear device in anger. The environmental damage and the impact will be felt for many generations to come by all of humanity, including here in South Africa. As an academic body, we should be appalled by South Africa's less than stellar performance here. We as academics have an obligation to speak up, or else history will judge us harshly. I sometimes think that the only ethical and morally principled government that we've had is the one that we imagined during our struggle years against apartheid. For we've hardly lived up to the expectations that we set ourselves for being a moral leader in this world. I feel that given the gravity of the situation in Ukraine and the impact that this is having on the academic community in that country, that the Academy should issue a statement condemning the Russian invasion and finding ways in which we can reach out to the fleeing Ukrainian academics. And of course, reaffirm our democratic rights to express ourselves freely on any matter of concern to society, since these questions have recently been raised in this regard. These scholars need to be honed, hopefully at regional institutions, to continue with their productive work and to plan to return hopefully soon back to Ukraine to begin the arduous rebuilding effort. I hope that South Africa will support these efforts and explore ways in which we can host some Ukrainian academics at our institutions. I think that that would be very symbolic. However, securing visas for Ukrainians to enter our country appears to be a problem, as has been reported, and this needs to be looked into. Furthermore, I believe that we must keep open our channels for cooperation with Russian scientists as well as with Ukrainian scientists in the spirit of scientific diplomacy. We should be deeply concerned about the scientists and academics in Russia who are imprisoned for expressing their views, and very circumspect about supporting a government who does this to its people, and particularly to its scientists. Many Russian scientists have risked so much to express their concerns, and we should not leave them out in the cold, so long as they're not contributing to the war effort, of course. I'd like to close on a positive note. There has been such an outpouring of international support for Ukraine by ordinary men and women from around the world, including here in South Africa, that I think that Ukraine in the post-war era, and I long for when peace will descend there, will strive to be a beacon of hope, an international destination for democracy, peace, and human rights. I long for that day. We should work toward that ideal. Thank you.
Thank you for a very thoughtful presentation as well, which moved from concepts of academic freedom through the issues around criticism, moral courage. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you, Professor Chetty, to, when we get to the Q&A, to take a look at one of the questions which talks about ethical responsibility of scientists. And indeed our obligation to speak. And I think that your comments on the importance of maintaining open channels of collaboration are very relevant. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to move on now to Professor Kaimanthri Moodley, who is a distinguished professor in the Department of Medicine and director of the Center for Medical Ethics and Law at Stellenbosch University. That center is also a collaborating center in bioethics with the World Health Organization. So I'm sure, again, a very different view, but one which I'm very much looking forward to hearing. So Professor Moodley, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you also to ASSAf and to the Royal Society for the invitation to join this esteemed panel today and to discuss a really important topical issue. So I'd just like to preface my contribution with a disclaimer. I'm not a political philosopher. And as you've already introduced me, I'm a family physician and a bioethicist. And so my expertise is in the field of medical ethics. However, I think any ethicist knows that the ethics of war is controversial and has a long and colorful history dating back to the Mahabharata, to Homer's Iliad, Plato's Republic, to Aristotle, and his questioning of a just cause for war, as well as various religious views around war, including the dominant Christian view relating to turning the other cheek. So when one indulges in forms of aggression, one needs to take into account various historical, religious, and philosophical perspectives that are really important. I think if we consider the response to the ethics of war, people would have perspectives ranging very widely on a spectrum, starting with the position of war being inherently unethical on the one end, and extending all the way to the other end, where arguments are made for what is called the just theory of war. And for those who support a just theory of war, two important questions are raised. Firstly, when is it appropriate to wage war? And secondly, how should we conduct ourselves when we do decide to wage war? So if we look into this end of the spectrum in a little more detail, I think a number of important principles are raised in arguments where people support the just theory of war. And so one of the principles is that there must be legitimate authority in waging this war. And we can certainly raise questions about that in numerous events historically where conflict has occurred, as well as in the current situation between Russia and the Ukraine. Then, of course, one requires the Aristotelian right cause for war. Clearly, you know, we may justify it in the name of self-defense, which rarely is the case, and in other instances, perhaps on a humanitarian basis to rescue others. Clearly, the humanitarian argument appears to be the most ethical reason why one would engage in war. There must be right intention in starting war in the first place. And of course, one would hope that there is a strong possibility of success. We can already see things going horribly wrong in the current war. It must be an action of last resort, another important principle, and of course, proportionality. So proportionality of the violence related to the harm that it inflicts. Now, if we move over to the second question around how war should be fought, a number of principles arise again. Here, the distinction between combatants and civil society is really important, and minimizing harm to those who are not so-called combatants in the war is incredibly important. Again, the principle of proportionality in terms of harms and gains from a level of violence that we know exists in the context of war. Is it militarily necessary to engage in this level of conflict? But most importantly, the principle of humanity in reducing harm and avoiding suffering. And I think it is quite evident in this war, as it has been in many other conflict zones throughout the world, that the degree of human suffering is often difficult to justify in the context of conflict and in the context of war. So what should the role be of science academies? I was triggered to think about this when ASSAf sent out the communication a few days ago relating to the fact that they were not going to make a statement on the current Ukraine war. And in contrast to this, I noticed that the International Science Council, with its various member organizations, had all issued statements, as had the National Academy of Science, Engineering and Medicine. And so it was a little bit concerning to me that our own ASSAf had not decided to issue a statement. So I do believe that one should not focus only on the current conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And as Professor Como indicated earlier, consistency is really important. And so perhaps we need to consider why we have not issued a statement previously related to conflicts in other parts of the world. And to move forward, I mean, to constantly argue that we are not going to issue a statement currently because we have failed to do so in the past is, to me, not a tenable argument. It is rather important, as we've started with this series of webinars, to acknowledge what we may have failed to do in the past, to consider reparation, and to move forward to ensure that we as scientists engage with the political issues that are occurring in the world, and that we issue strong statements denouncing acts of violence and war, irrespective of where in the world they are occurring. And so on this note, I'm happy to conclude by saying that science and ethics are inextricably related. We've already heard from Professor Chetty about the role of science in war. As we continue to develop technology, artificial intelligence, drones, we need to think more seriously and more carefully about the impact of those technological developments, and to think very strongly of issues around scientific integrity and ethics as they relate, and our role, our future role, that is going to be important in many future wars to come. Because as we know, we hope there will be few and indeed none. But as human nature is, it is more a position of idealism if we think that this will end with the current Russian-Ukraine war. Thank you.
Thank you very much for putting a different and fascinating view in terms of ethics and the ethics of war, and the clarity, thank you, on definitions around ethics in war. And I particularly appreciate your last point about science and ethics and the relationship with technology and the application of technology. So thank you very much indeed for that. And before I introduce our next speaker, I want to just ask the panelists, please, to take a look at the question and answer box, because there are some questions which are directly directed at certain members of the panel, but also we need to respond to some of those. So we will do that in the Q&A session. Right, our last speaker for this evening, but certainly I know not least, Professor Salim Valley, who is going to speak as the director of the Center of Education Rights and Transformation, which is a SACHI chair, National SACHI chair, and his expertise is around community and education of adults, which I think is a very fascinating area. Professor Valley is at the University of Johannesburg at the moment and has been for a while. He also is well recognized for his interests in education linked to society. So Professor Valley, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to the organizers for this discussion and its excellent framing in the brief but profoundly meaningful background note that accompanied the invite. It certainly, as we all agree, comes at a very critical time, a time when development, the environment, and reason face sustained assault, and when the world lurches inexorably and dangerously towards ecological disasters, the horror of war, avoidable recurring pandemics, and an increase in inequalities and hunger. And while the war in Ukraine and its consequences might have prompted this discussion, let's understand that these dangerous times have been the reality for many people around the world long before the invasion of Ukraine. Just to take a few examples, since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, over 1 million Iraqis, according to some estimates, have died. And this is without examining the Pandora's box of ongoing turmoil and the recidivism the invasion by NATO powers unleashed on the world. Or Yemen, where according to the UNDP report late last year, the death toll since the Saudi UAE invasion, supported by NATO countries through direct and indirect ways, reached 377,000. 70% of the deaths are of children under the age of 5. But also let us not forget the millions killed on our own continent in recent times, and those who amass wealth out of the conflicts, those who supply the weapons and the brazen racial double standards of the dominant world media, which accords differential weight, as Stella has said already, to the lives of people around the world. This, of course, does not minimize the agony and sorrow of war in Ukraine and the terrible price paid by civilians in Ukraine, the millions of refugees, and the peace activists in Russia. So I fully endorse the reason for this webinar. Solidarity could hardly be more urgent and imperative, and more than ever, our responsibility now is to seek the knowledge that the background note talks about for the good of humanity. But are we doing that? I will argue shortly that the leadership of the Academy is failing dismally on this score, and we cannot separate what is happening in our own country and the role and purpose and the functions of our Academy with solidarity outside of our borders. But before I do that, I just want to say that there are precedents for these times when scientists and others are urgently called to take a stand. For example, Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, and 9 other distinguished scientists and intellectuals introduced the very famous Notice to the World, which later became known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto in 1955. It opens with the words, "In the tragic situation which confronts humanity, we feel that scientists should assemble in conference to appraise the perils that have arisen. We appeal as human beings to human beings. Remember your humanity." Or even long before the manifesto, the important Zimmerwald Conference held in 1915 after the First World War, but there's no time for that. I too am disturbed by what purportedly was a directive from the Department of Science and Innovation to various organizations that they should not discuss this matter, to quote, should not engage in any action of any kind which could be construed as a political commentary or political reaction to the developments in Ukraine. But I also have queries about the ASSAf statement that Kimantri mentioned, or rather, as a friend said, the non-statement that was issued to members on the 11th of March. I think, interestingly, it justifies this by referring to, and I quote, on the crisis in Palestine and the calls for the Academy to make statements on that and the devastating consequences for Palestinians in the occupied territories. For me, in terms of the first issue, the directive issue, the Palestinian-American public intellectual Edward Said sets out a very compelling and powerful case for intellectuals to take a stand, and in his now famous phrase, speak truth to power. His 1993 Wreath Lectures, published in 1994 as representations of the intellectual, is more than an adequate riposte to those who want us to remain silent and inactive. In the conclusion, he says that nothing in my mind is more reprehensible than those habits of mind in the intellectual that induce avoidance, the characteristic turning away from a difficult and principled position. But as promised, I want to briefly mention the state of affairs in the South African Academy and whether we are producing the knowledge for the public good spoke about in the background note, and that whether we are creating the basis for solidarity with the vulnerable in our own country and elsewhere. And so we have to be self-critical. These are not new questions. And as early as 1999, the late George Sabotsky, working with others at UWC's EPU, posed a number of still pertinent questions in an article, Beyond the Entrepreneurial University, the potential role of South Africa's institutions in reconstruction and development. He argued that there are two tendencies affecting higher education. On the one hand, universities and colleges are under pressure to become more market-oriented and to respond rapidly to changes in information technology and knowledge production. And on the other hand, there is a growing concern that they should work for the benefit of society, promoting social equity and responding to community needs. Neville Alexander, too, in a commentary in what seemed like another era during the debate relating to academic freedom and institutional autonomy between John Higgins, Roger Saffold, and Henri Dutoit, forcefully argued that the university is accountable not only to the collegium, but also the various constituencies beyond its walls. And I have to extend Neville Alexander's argument, something he knew well, that there is remarkable energy in the world beyond the academy. In some instances, you know, for discussions about change, about war, about poverty, about climate, catastrophe, and quite often theorization, I have to concede, more germane and sophisticated than in many of our formal institutions. So we need to think more about how the work we do as scholars coheres with the struggles of those pro-social justice activists outside the university. We have not chosen the trajectory suggested by Alexander and others. Some universities portray themselves, and many of them are genuinely keen on what is called community engagement and committed to social justice. But many have critiqued this as a corporate branding strategy consistent with market constitution rather than reflecting actual practice and institutional change. Are we speaking to the issues of the day, or worse, are we perpetuating inequality? Two recent talks might provide the answer. There are many other examples, but I'll just choose those two very quickly. A few days ago, while giving a lecture honoring Don Matera, Jonathan Jensen spoke about xenophobia, and I quote, "The dangerous messaging of our government throughout the civil servants to do headcounts of non-South African employees, and worse, the complicity of some of our universities." And in a discussion earlier this month at UJ, Salim Badat responded to my VC's emphasis on the changes that 4IR will bring and asked whether it would benefit the impoverished workers, Black people, women, and refugees, or would the beneficiaries be the usual ones, the North, the rich, the middle class, whites, men, and city developers, dwellers? He says, "I argued that lest we imagine 4IR as the harbinger of a technocratic utopia, we had to confront the fact that the first three industrial revolutions did not create a just and humane world. Why did we imagine that 4IR would do so?" I also need to say that we should not aspire to mimic some of the US universities where the modern scientific enterprise, especially outside of the life sciences, is intimately and directly linked to what some now call the military industrial academic complex. Disproportionately, resources are earmarked for technologies with a military and corporate bent. In a publish or perish world where scientists are judged on how many research dollars they bring to the university, the military is often the only realistic source of funding for many in the US. And Toni Morrison, the late Toni Morrison, presciently and lyrically counseled some time ago during her Nobel Peace Prize accepted speech in 1993, the violence of this. She talked about of politics and history calculated to render the suffering of millions mute. The arrogant pseudo-empirical language crafted to lock creative people into cages of inferiority and hopelessness, and how, whether it is the proud but calcified language of the academy or the commodity-driven language of science. And she talked about how this so-called respectability and patriotism moves relentlessly towards the bottom line and the bottomed out mind, and it cannot permit new knowledge or encourage the mutual exchange of ideas. So I think the invite letter also mentions that history shows that science can do great good and great harm, as people have mentioned. A writer, Pankaj Mehta, writes, if we have learned anything from the last century, it is that scientists with resources and clearly defined goals can achieve the seemingly impossible. If scientists can make missiles that fly thousands of miles carrying nuclear bombs and drones that can be controlled from halfway around the world, they can certainly develop technology to actually benefit humanity. By the way, since 2001, drones from the Nevada Air Base have been used to kill at least 10,000 people on the other side of the world, many of them civilians. But there are alternatives, and there's hope, and there's radical scientists who have been inspired by new social movements. They have begun a long time ago after the Vietnam War to develop an alternative vision of science. They started to ask heretical questions. Why are we scientists? For whose benefit do we work? What is the full measure of our moral and social responsibility? Moving towards the conclusion, I just want to say that the Russell-Einstein Manifesto began with the lines, we appeal as human beings to human beings. Remember your humanity. And the World Academy of Art and Science, which was established in 1960, as a result, partly because of the Manifesto, continues the tradition by acknowledging the vacuum in global leadership, the loss of trust and confidence in national and institutional and international institutions, but point out that while the challenges we have to confront may be greater today than yesterday, but so too our collective knowledge and capacity for effective global response. The voice of science, the aspirations of youth, the just demand for human rights, the sanity of human wisdom, and the resourcefulness of human creativity compel us to call with renewed resolve for unprecedented steps to replace the failed policies that have brought the world to this present state. Neville Alexander, in a speech in honor of the late Sipho Maseko, who he knew, and who Neville claimed exemplified one of those young people of the 1980s, who was totally committed to the liberation of South Africa. Neville lamented that the values that drove people like Maseko and others of his generation had been systematically eroded by the eruption of the narcissistic dog-eat-dog virus that is spreading spread across the world during this current era of the hegemony of neoliberal capitalism. And he posed the question, which I think is a key question: how is it possible in the era of neoliberal barbarism to implant a different set of ethical values among especially the younger people in South Africa and elsewhere, in spite of the many structural constraints that determine the individual existential projects and struggles, and the massive bombardment of negative and self-destructive messages emanating from the media and other sources. And he exhorts us to return to the source. We are appalled by the looting of state resources, by the malfeasance in a situation where millions of youth live in poverty. So we need to examine that. We need to talk about how relations between human beings mean nothing if they are not commodified, and how this entrepreneurial trajectory is not getting us to the ethical society we want. And I need to end by saying that liberalism's inability to fulfill its promises allows the extreme right, the xenophobes, the fundamentalists, the tribalists, and opportunists to capitalize on frustrations. And so While we might have no Panglossian solutions, there must be alternatives, and it should be the work of the academy and science to muster our intellectual resources towards that. And in the interim, let's hold on to the deferred vision of Biko. The great powers may have done wonders in giving the world an industrial and military look, but the great gift has to still come from Africa, giving the world a more human face. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Burley. I'm not going to try to summarize all of the comments that you have made, but I do take a note of your call for solidarity and your call for leadership in the Academy to take a stand. And I will, in a little while, ask the members of the panel to make some comments about that, but particularly Professor Jansen. You made some very valid points there, and I can see from the questions in the Q&A that you've stimulated a number of thoughts around solidarity, around the precedents that have been set or not, and the need for scientists perhaps to take a stand, not only in terms of comment, but also in terms of the kind of work that they do. So thank you very much. I'm going to ask the panelists now to address some of the comments that we have. A lot of comments in the and questions in the question and answer box, and I don't know that we can go through them one by one, but I would like to just say there are, for a start, several which talk about the need to make some sort of a statement or take some sort of a stand, and there is the question of whether or not that stand should be a statement or action. So perhaps, and I'm just busy going back up there, the very first comment is a question of whether or not the problem is not just science, but actually also political will to make decisions and take a stand. So perhaps I'm going to link that with one or two of the other questions which were directed to Professor Chetty about the role of scientists, not just in weapons of war, but in education and being activists. Professor Chetty, would you like to start this, and then I'll invite the other panelists to make a comment to some of the questions that they see in the box.
Thank you very much, Professor Burton. So I sure appreciate the contributions from the other panelists as well. I think there is certainly lots of food for thought. The key thing, the way in which I think about this, is that the approach by academics is very different from the approach of politicians. We've got to recognize that, and if we don't, we'll continue to talk past each other. So as has already been stated by Stella in particular, that academic discourse based on critical thinking, on uncovering the truth and speaking truth to power and being courageous to do this. But the political discourse is governed by a very different set of principles, and we've got to understand that. Even we've got to recognize that, even though we don't always understand that. And that's often, in the context of BRICS, it would be basically quid pro quo. South Africa agrees not to ruffle feathers, and in return for something that's not yet clear to me. So what it does require then is much more discourse. To counter the ways in which politicians work in this era, is for us to constantly speak out and create the opportunities for us to be critical and to apply the principles of academic discourse, which is to always be very ethical and honest and evidence-based in what it is that we say. The moment that academics themselves become political and slanting kind of data and evidence in support of very particular viewpoints is when we will undermine the academy greatly. So really what I'm calling for is much more critical discourse, and you know, even when there's appears to be a suggestion that academics cannot and should not comment on this matter, I think especially then, without hesitation, I would have really appreciated it if the Academy had put out a very bold statement rather than just simply refer to documents that are on file that we have covered this and it's really already been addressed. You know, the difficulty about democracy, Stephanie, is that it requires continual work. We'll be saying the same things over and over again until the day we die, unfortunately, because society does need to be reminded frequently about the things that we cherish. So I want to just very quickly address the comment by David Jacobs. There have been a couple of comments that have been directed to me, but the point here, David, about highlighting the importance of ethics in science. Yes, we cannot stop our scientists from delving into all manner of things, including, somebody mentioned, artificial intelligence. We're always looking for the positive benefits of this, but some folk lurking in the shadows of our faculties are constantly looking for nefarious applications, and we've got to call that out. We've got to be very vigilant to that, and it helps greatly if we train our students in the ethical approaches to science. There are other comments as well, Stephanie, but I'd rather just pass this on to other colleagues before I return to those. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I can ask Professor Moodley if she would like to just comment on the question from Jeffrey Bolton, which is commenting on your, as I said, eloquently articulated rules. And his question is, are the rules that you articulated more observed in the breach than in the observance, and how do we adapt our positions to the reality of that?
So you see the rules I mentioned as part of the just war theory, firstly, are often criticized as representing a strong male morality perspective in terms of war, in terms of underlying philosophical paradigms, and in that respect are not always accepted. But if, you know, one has to take the position that war is absolutely essential in a particular context, then those rules ought to apply, but they often do not. And we therefore cannot, you know, justify that a level of violence and conflict that often occurs in the context of war using those principles. So there are the principles that are laid out, and in an ideal setting, those would justify war. But what we do know is that it is often the case that these criteria are not met. And the basic, you know, premise is that essentially war is unethical. So it's really very difficult to justify it. There are a few people certainly who subscribe to the just war theory, and you know, when one assesses war, one would assess that particular level of conflict based on these principles. But I think the reality is that they are often not there. They're often not followed.
Thank you. I'm trying fairly hard to group some of these questions so that we can address them. One of them, and maybe Professor Nkoma would like to take this one, is the question around remaining relevant in terms of collaboration with, for example, Russian scientists. And there is one question, quite a specific question, about an invitation that somebody has had to review a paper produced by Russian authors. And the question is, should we be going ahead with that kind of interaction? And how should we be viewing collaboration? There are some views expressed that collaboration should continue, because we've seen how many stands the Russian scientists have been making against the war. So the broad question is around how we continue or don't to collaborate with for example, those who have initiated this kind of conflict. Stella, would you like to have a go at that?
Oh, that's a tough one. Let me just turn on the mic. Is my mic on? Yes.
Yes, it is.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'll try, and I'm sure my colleagues will add in. You know, in fact, I'm an editor on one of the journals, and we got an interesting communication from Emerald Publishing advising us to, first of all, to be empathetic and considerate of scholars from Ukraine who may be delayed in doing revisions on articles or asking for more time. And then they also said we might have the problem of reviewers who might see a paper from a person with a Russian surname and refuse to review the paper. And so we needed to start thinking about that. I think for me, a distinction has to be made about individuals versus a state action. You know, I don't think that Vladimir Putin asked for people to vote on whether or not to go to war. So I think it's kind of difficult to then ostracize everyone who is Russian because they are from a particular place, just as I would not want to be condemned just for being a person born in the US, and so I'm also an ugly American. So I think it's really not taking a blanket approach, but to understand that lots of these war gets started often by our leaders, not necessarily with the consent of everyone in the state. So that would be my general sense. I'd like to see what my colleagues think.
Thank you. Professor Valley, can I ask you if you might take, going from that, some of the comments that have been made around academic freedom in terms of the suggestion that our government asked scientists not to comment on this war in a political way. And I do want to say, and I know that Himla Sudial would say this too, and Jonathan, ASSAf was not given that instruction. But nevertheless, perhaps you'd like to just address the issue of where academic freedom relates to instructions, if you like, to scientific bodies to comment or not.
Yes, I mean, there are a number of issues here, and I think the media reports of the directive really do need to be corrected. I think, you know, the issues are very important, and we certainly should not do the kind of things some institutions are doing. The University of Florida, I think many people know, have stopped the Karl Marx reading room, mistaking Karl Marx for being a Russian. Tchaikovsky has been banned in some places. Russian salad, which has nothing to do with Russia. I mean, it's absurd, really. So I think the kind of attempt to support Ukrainian people should be thought through quite carefully. And I think the last thing we should do is join the mania for armaments there or encouraging that in any way or form. And I really think that, you know, I have trouble in separating taking a political stance, as I've already talked about, and being an academic. And really, I would advise people to read Edward Said's book if they haven't already. I really think that, you know, NATO is not blameless either. And I don't subscribe with the view promoted by George W. Bush, who said that if you're not with us, you are against us. There are many people who oppose the invasion of Ukraine, but who have seen what Putin has been doing long before Ukraine, Grozny, he leveled Grazi. You couldn't put two bricks together, but there was no outcry, and we need to be very careful. I think that PACB, the Palestinian academics who promote the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign, have a very nuanced view of calls such as boycott. They don't call for boycotts against individuals, and they've learned from the blanket boycott against our own struggle. They talk about exactly what Professor Nkomo was talking about, people who are linked to the structures of oppression, of military violence, of occupation, and there are many. And so we need to have a nuanced look, and I think we need to be careful we need to speak out. That's not the issue, but I think we need to weigh up many of these things. Just in closing, Stephanie, if you allow me, you know, Hillary and Stephen Rose, people who Kimantri might know because of their work, they're geneticists, talk about how many academics, even liberal and leftist ones, collaborated actively with German geneticists who provided the so-called scientific foundations for that ugly concept, lives not worth living, and Russian hygiene, racial hygiene, right up to the outbreak of war. And it wasn't defenders of academic freedom that stopped that cooperation, but really the declaration of war that did. And those very people who were responsible for that, the self-same leading geneticists in Germany, serving the Nazi regime. When Germany fell, the Allies restored many of them as heads of laboratories in the West. So I think this is really telling. And so the kind of simplistic view of academic boycott is a problem. And I think that we really do need nuance here. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I just want to say, I'm actually going to ask Renata, there's a couple of comments that these questions are not visible to our audience. Is it possible to make them visible? We have now more than 25 questions, and I can't read them all out. It'll just take all the time we have left. But I'm going to direct one further question to Nithia, and then I'm going to ask Professor Jansen if he would like to just perhaps make a statement or a comment. I don't want to use the word statement. Make some comment on the various questions that are directed towards the Academy, and then we'll ask Professor Gledhill to make her concluding remarks. I think at the very least we can put these questions into a document and make it public on our website, but I'm not quite sure, and I don't have the technical know-how to make them visible to you all now. Professor Chetty, the question that I wanted to ask you to perhaps address briefly is the question of the attitudes of scientists to war. The question was that perhaps scientists have changed their attitude towards war. And another comment about the fact that perhaps we kind of numb to it rather than the activist approaches that Professor Valley mentioned in history. So the question is, have we changed our attitudes towards war, and what does it mean for future wars?
So it's the scientific community is a very big community, Stephanie. I think that that the Academy, so long as it's untethered to the government and reasonably critical and independent, you will always find that the viewpoints on war would be would be quite strongly against any aggression. But of course, the collaborating side is we've got to recognize that in directed research programs, and this is why we've got to be very careful about cozying up to the government. Scientists need to be careful about this. In South Africa, we've actually seen the positive side to this. Astronomy in South Africa is a very large research endeavor, but it has to a great extent been driven by the government. It's been of strategic importance to the government. This is one example where science has benefited greatly by cozying up to the government. But we should do this with care and with a lot of circumspection, because if we do get into bed with the government, it can have deleterious consequences. So there are many directed research programs in Denel, historically at the CSIR in the 80s and so on in South Africa, but elsewhere around the world, where scientists, because they're employed and this is their source of income, they're sworn to secrecy, and they work on projects that are driven by the government. And that is the community that we've got to be careful about. I sure wish that we could have this done in more openness, more transparency, but it's it's shrouded in secrecy, isn't it? And I worry about that. We cannot stop scientists from delving into a whole range of different scientific topics, whether it's stem cell research or topics into research endeavors into anthrax and various other chemical systems. But the point is that there are folk that are really keenly looking out for opportunities to exploit these scientific findings for evil, and that's what we as the academic grouping needs to be very vigilant about. And all we can do, of course, is not pick up arms. We don't have that possibility, and gladly we don't. But we have the intellectual capacity and resources to stand up to the cruelties that can come out of this. So really, I guess that my most important message is that to counter a lot of what is going on in these dark spaces where scientists engage collaboratively with politicians for nefarious agendas, is that we've got to speak up constantly and be vigilant to this. Our democracies need that. Professor Burton.
Thank you very much indeed. Apparently the questions should now be visible to our audience, so I'll leave them there for you to have a look at. I'm going to give the second last word to the President of the Academy, Professor Jansen. Would you like to address one or two of the issues that have come up, particularly around the role of the Academy? Jonathan? Jonathan's camera is not on, so I can't actually see him. No, I can't raise him. So I think perhaps we'll move on, and the next the next item, and we have just a few minutes for it, is, I think, the conclusion of our discussion for this evening. I do want to say we have plans for further discussions and further webinars of this sort, so don't be disheartened if we haven't addressed all of those questions this evening. We will be addressing them in due course. So let me hand over now to Professor Eigil Gledhill, who is going to make some concluding remarks for us.
Hello, good evening. Wow, that was a really interesting, really informative seminar. I believe that we've looked at several topics. Should science and scientists take a stand? I hear or have heard, yes, but checking on their consistency and their integrity with self-knowledge of whether we are, in fact, creating the basis for solidarity with the vulnerable in our own society. I heard an intent to speak out, to speak truth to power. The summaries that I'm giving perhaps indicate some trends, but I certainly recognize the immense wisdom that is coming through the Q&A session. Thank you for that. it is up to scientists to be both ethical and honest. I think a couple of statements just to add to the discussion have called for evidence-based arguments. We've noted that scientists could become political, and that could well undermine the space for rationality in our academy. The relationship to academic freedom has been an important part of this discussion. And of course, there is reference to the pressures experienced in universities. Certainly, it's been noted that in terms of politicians and scientific bodies, that ASSAf was not requested not to comment. And I think that there is a great deal of thought about the fact that this war in Ukraine has prompted this discussion. But it is not the only conflict that concerns us as scientists. It may well require, the conflict in general requires our work to understand what is happening. It is part of our definitions of science. Thank you, Stella, for those. To deepen understanding of war, science should offer explanations and predictions, and these may well be used to avert conflict before it has started, in my view. An emerging direction of the discussion was strengthening the solidarity of scientists across the frontiers of war, standing in solidarity with our fellows. And I would like to thank you for the mention of the Russell Einstein Manifesto, and definitely appeal to the humanities, to human beings as human beings. Remember our humanity. The intent of this webinar was to make a space for rational discussion. And I thank each speaker, Professor Jansen, Professor Nkomo, Professor Chetty, Professor Moodley, Professor Valley, and Professor Burton for guiding the discussion. I believe that we are scratching the surface here, and there is a great deal more to talk about. Thank you, everyone. Back to you, Professor Burton.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Gledhill. And colleagues, we have reached the end of our time and the end of this discussion. Just so that you know, we will save all of these questions, and we will organize another discussion in due course where we can perhaps address some of the issues that have been raised. And I think one of the comments I just want to go back to, because it struck me also, was a comment by Benedict Ferro, who said he wanted to align his question with what Professor Nkomo had said, the very profound point she made on equality that is still entrenched, even in the midst of inequality, which is still entrenched, even in the midst of a hostile situation. And I think perhaps that might be the starting point, perhaps, for our next discussion around what can science do to ensure some positive impact across the board in terms of all of these different kinds of conflicts. I'm going to I see Professor Sudial has put on her video. Himla, did you want to mention anything before we actually close?
No, thank you. And I just wanted to express my gratitude to you, Stephanie, for steering us and moderating through these sessions, and to add my voice of thanks to all the speakers. I want to reiterate that ASSAf has not been gagged in any way, as has been suggested by some. We have never received any correspondence from any government department telling us what to do. ASSAf has previously put out statements regarding the freedom of academics, and we stick by those imperatives. I think our colleagues have shared with us thoughts from both sides of the coin. that we will take to the drawing board as we champion the next topic for discussion. And as you say, there are, as Eagle has says, we've just scratched the surface. And obviously, as we bring some of these salient issues to the fore, I must add my voice to the issues regarding solidarity. I think that is a space that we as an academy need to take forward. And I want to remind everyone that the Academy is not me, the executive officer, or the secretariat. The Academy is made up of members. We're a membership-based organization, and I'd like to see the strength of this membership come to the fore in putting forward recommendations and collective thoughts on how we could take these issues forward. I challenge all the members on this webinar, even on the panel, to voice your thoughts in written ways to me as the executive officer so that I could put it to council for endorsement. So that's my challenge that I have as executive officer, to keep the peace from the onslaught of some members that have been directing their contempt to me. You are the members of the Academy, so let's make it happen together. So with that, I want to once again thank even my colleagues for the background work in hosting this, and to everybody for joining in and making this a successful food for thought session. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, Professor Burton.
Thanks, Himla. And may I just say, on behalf of the Academy and on behalf of the Royal Society, members of the Royal Society have also been part of this.
Yeah.
Thank you to the organizing team. Thank you for the quick responses. Thank you to the audience for your very insightful comments and questions, which we have saved and we will address in the next round. So, and a final second thank you to all of the panelists who have given us so much food for thought. Thank you everybody who has been here. I wish you a good evening and I look forward to our next seminar. Thank you so much for joining us.